when discussing nostalgia in relation to contemporary socially engaged art practices. The first entry point could be the wider relation between the arts and historiography that has a relatively long history itself. If I expose one well-known example, when defining poetic language as a specific type of expression, and poetic language here largely represents arts in general, Aristotle defines it by making a comparison with historiography. If I simplify, while historiography is mediating things from the past or the past itself in a way of singularity, so singularity of events, people, things, art is mediating past in such a way it is universally accessible in aesthetic sense. This universal aesthetic accessibility signifies the potential that art can mediate the past in such a way that anybody from any point of time can relive, re-experience it as it would have happened to them. Similar to Aristotle, majority of philosophical thematization of the relation between the arts and historiography were not in the strict sense focused on legitimizing art's commemorative potential, but were predominantly centralized on the idea art can establish an intertemporal and/or intercultural dialogue or communication. And through that, they were focused on the legitimation of the arts as one of the realms where historical consciousness and the experience of time flow can be generated rather than past revived. If I go further with the relationship between the definitions of arts and historiography, while focusing on contemporary art, it is crucial to expose an important epistemological change that occurred approximately in the early mid-20th century in the framework of the critical theory of society's contributions on art and culture. While art historical knowledge from the late 19th century still believed the past as mediated through the different types of human languages, can be universally accessible because each particular human being is at the same time the representative of universal humanity, theoretical contributions from this period largely criticize this claim. For instance, Theodor Adorno claimed an artwork, at least an authentic one, contains the truth of a certain historical period of which it is a part of, in a negative way, whereby we cannot universally access this contained truth from just any point of time. The only way it can be accessible to those who are not its contemporaries is if both historical eras share some similarities. Something similar can be traced also in contributions of Walter Benjamin. For instance, when introducing the concept of dialectical image, in most cases applied to the film montage or collage as a technique of organizing image space. As in the case of Adorno, the dialectical image derives from the conduct to form a new mode of critical materialist historiography, whereby its aim is evidently not to revive the past or transmit memory, but to present past in such a way it leads the past to bring the present into a critical state. So the reviving of the past through, for instance, imagery is primarily in the service of the present. The main idea is to uproot and shock what has been constructed as the present, as well as to uproot the established relationship between the past and the present, deriving from the linear developmental model of time. Based on this simplified summarization, it can be clear that socially engaged art practices, predominantly stemming from the critical theory, are not nostalgic and specifically Yugo-nostalgic in the same way as part of popular culture in the ex-Yugoslav countries since the 90s onward is. However, I will try to show some of the contemporary art practices that appropriate imagery or historical documents related to the Yugoslav socialist period nevertheless stem from certain affects and or mediate certain affects that can be related to nostalgia. For that reason, I will introduce 3 examples by a post-socialist generation of Slovene artists born from the late 1970s onwards, and primarily focus on the question what exactly is the subject of nostalgia. My first example is the artwork titled Newswheel, The News is Ours from 2014 by Nika Autor, which consists of several authors' previous work, often executed in the form of newswheel. That has a relatively rich history in Yugoslav experimental filmography. In her work, Autor usually follows the strategy of juxtaposing different eras through imagery or documentary footages. In the particular case of Newsreel, The News is Ours, this juxtaposition is connected to the history of the second biggest city in Slovenia, Maribor. The period of the 40s represented with the anti-fascist partisan struggle, the period of the 80s represented with the industrial workers' protests, and the present time, represented with the biggest protests since Slovenia's independence, rising against capitalist corruption between 2012 and 2013. So one of the exhibition display of the artwork consists of the documents of the mentioned eras and contexts, including footages of the teachers and pupils in uniform singing patriotic Yugoslav song, as well as a document from author's own childhood in the form of her first grade exercise book picturing the Red Star and a female soldier with flowers. This juxtaposition of different points from the past and, at the time, present time, at first glance does not offer any clear narrative. The particular statement of artists is very vague and hard to determine. However, we could say Newsreel follows Benjamin's idea of dialectical image, where the juxtaposition of imagery primarily indicates similarities and difference between the eras it originates from, whereby either in the video or the exhibition display, there is no continuity of time flow, but above all, constant ruptures, paradoxes, contradiction, as well as, of course, certain similarities. Another art example, the performance Everything We've Lost While We've Gone Living by the Slovene collective Beton Ltd, has a relatively similar structure as author's artwork. In accordance with the established methodology of the so-called post-dramatic theater, the performance consists of a mixture of different documentary material and personal memories, in this case of the performers themselves. As in the case of Autor, the performance is built on the three distinct temporal eras: the birth year of the performance, 1976 or 77, together with the context of the former Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, the double transition period between 1995 and 1996. So on the one hand, the post-socialist transition period, and on the other hand, personal transition, since this is also the year of performers' high school graduation, and the present time, the year 2013, that was, as in the case of Autor, the same time the period of the biggest protest wave in Slovenia since its independence, as well as the period of the austerity measures after the economic crisis from 2008. Nevertheless, there is an important difference between the performance and before mentioned Autor's installation. Namely, differentiated time periods in the performers are represented through a specific relation of the performers towards it, as well as specific models or ideologies of temporality. The socialist period is, for instance, performed through the story of the glamorous Haludovo Palace Hotel built in 1971 on the Croatian island Krk, a sort of capitalist utopia inside the Yugoslav self-governing socialist reality. So in the first part, performers are indirectly making a link between the socialist political project and post-war Western capitalism through some of their common aspects. For instance, they were both grounded in the specific ideology characterized by the faith in the permanent progress and accordingly guaranteed better future. Otherwise, the general position of the performers can be deciphered especially from the title. As they have explained, the what they have lost is above all their enthusiasm and the idea that everything is possible. In addition to that, in the performance, the passive itself is being represented through the cynical distance, which is supposed to, according to Boris Buden, coincided with the end of post-socialist transition itself. So transition to post-socialism, according to Buden, goes in parallel to the transition of cynicism. However, the cynical distance towards the represented past in the performance is only the other side of melancholia and mourning. The last part of performance labelly oscillates between, on the one hand, adult sobriety and the so-called politics of capitalist realism, which is also marked by kind of aversion to utopias, and on the other hand, mourning as a sort of overcoming the loss, and as well as left-wing melancholia, in most cases with no positive outcome, which is in general one of the more common features of the global post-socialist situation. In recent decades, left-wing melancholia has been predominantly defined based on Freud's emphasis on melancholia in general, which is supposed to be marked by the loss or lack of the object of love. The main characteristic of left-wing melancholia it is not so much a form of mourning for the lost object itself, but for the specific relationship we once had with the object. It is therefore a mourning for the object as an object of love, because it, for example, in the period of adulthood and sobriety, proved to be unworthy of our love or commitment. In the case of left-wing melancholia in post-socialist conditions, this object of love and investment is, of course, above all the struggle for emancipation as a historical experience that nowadays affects the loss of direction in the form of truth, values, goals, and morals of the current anti-capitalist leftist endeavors. In this regard, it is important to emphasize that combination of or transition from the mourning for the lost object of love and left-wing melancholia as a performative position could also be seen as something that is in a way forced. Post-socialist condition and long 20th century political history itself disables that the expression of hopeful or utopian political standpoint could be taken seriously or perceived as authentic. So the cynical distance and melancholia is therefore actually the only way one could generate an authentic effect and not to produce, if I use more popular term, an effect of cringe. My third example is a project from nowhere to none place, a pioneer railway by the Monument Group, a collective whose art practice is predominantly focused on the mapping and archiving hidden, abandoned, unwanted, or otherwise forgotten 20th century monuments, architecture, and public spaces. Very often, specifically Yugoslav modernist architectural heritage, and in most cases, their projects are executed in the form of the intervention in the public space. The art project from nowhere to none place was primarily executed as a performative soundwalk action that took place in Ljubljana at the site of the former Pioneer Railroad on the former Tito's Day of Youth in 2019, and later, so this year, executed as an exhibition consisting of documentation of this very action, as well as other historical materials that were used for the research of the topic. The topic of the project is centralized on the phenomenon of the pioneer railways originating in the USSR and spread all over the Eastern Bloc that were a kind of extracurricular institution for children. More particular, the project focused, of course, on the pioneer railway built by work brigades in Ljubljana in 1948, its operating function as well as memories on it. Since the remains of route of the railway that was closed in 1954 can nowadays still be partially seen because they form a bicycle lane in proximity to Ljubljana's largest city park, we could say the art project indirectly juxtaposes two different eras and their particular ideologies of care. On the one hand, the care for a youth ideological breeding, and on the other, physical self-care deriving from the neoliberal individualized responsibility of one's own well-being. However, the temporality performers are representing with their action in the sunwalk can hardly be defined as present tense in the strict sense. Unlike Autor and Beton Ltd. in their work, the performers in From Nowhere to Non-Place, and here I think also the title itself is quite telling, are executing their actions in a disinterested and detached way and in somehow vacuum temporality, which is achieved especially with their etheric movements and with all the science fiction iconography. So the position of, conditionally speaking, narrators here is relatively close to Benjamin's melancholic perceiving the reality as a ruin of the past without any real anchor to form an affective relationship towards it. The most obvious difference between the examples is perhaps that in the performance For Everything We've Lost While We've Gone Living by artists born in the late 70s, a historical narrative is still being formed. So a narrative that mixes personal biography and wider social circumstances, while the other two examples just juxtapose the past and the present tense without any real context between the two. We could say the condition of possibility of this historical narrative, so also the possibility to connect the past and the present, the imagery or things and our own aesthetic experience or words, and to make some sense out of this connection, is somehow originating in the ability to mourn and, at least in principle, also to get over the loss. Even if the mourning and the continuous temporality is absent from the other two art examples, I think all of them share, at least in a latent way, what I call nostalgia for the future. So the nostalgia for a period when the experience of hope, optimism, imagining of a better or at least different future could still be generated. In other words, in the case of post-socialist generation of socially engaged artists, whose work represents some chapters from the Yugoslav socialist period, the main all-pervading sentiment is not that the golden past have passed and the wish to revive past through the memory of it. It signifies the nostalgia for the period when the investment in the future was still possible and more omnipresent experience. On the one hand, the nostalgia for the future signifies nostalgia for a certain investment that either, as in the case of Nika Autor, refers to the socialist emancipation project, or as in the case of Beton Ltd. Or Noniment Group, to a more everyday experience of hope and faith in the future. Namely, if today there is some imagining of the future in contemporary art, it is, of course, predominantly dystopian. So this type of nostalgia, therefore, already derives from the imperative to be mobile. So the problem here is primarily the inability to move forward, either in the literal or figurative sense, mixed with some fascination over the fact explicit expression of hope or faith in the better future could once be an authentic feeling. The main sentiments nostalgia for the future derives from are being stuck in time, or space for that matter, the inability to move forward, to progress, to develop, being unable to imagine the future because it is already colonized or decided, being condemned to the constant perpetuation of the present, meaning the existing. It could be said it is to some extent a generational specific type of nostalgia, in a way a second degree nostalgia that parasites on the cultural memory generated through, for instance, imagery and symbols that is in its basis nostalgic. Or to put it otherwise, nostalgia for the future is nostalgia that is nostalgic of nostalgia.